All right, should be recording now. So today we have one of my favorite people to talk to again, the Amateur Exegete. And so for those who might have missed the other conversations that he's been a part of, can you provide a brief introduction to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, basically just a blogger. I'm also on social media with Twitter, and I deal mainly with biblical studies and dabble occasionally into counter apologetics and very, very rarely into philosophy of religion. That's your thing, not mine.
Well, I'm still trying to I don't know. I feel like there's all these people that are younger than me that still know way more about philosophy of religion than me. Like I'm talking to all these people and I'm like, sheesh. Because, as when I was a Christian, and it probably is similar to you, it's like I was reading a lot of theology and just reading the Bible over and over, and not as much deep. I mean, I would read some more deep, what would be considered deeper theological stuff, but that's not really the conversations I'm having now. So, nope. I mean, I feel like it's helped me some, but
Well, it's like you're having to relearn everything, like starting over.
Yeah.
It can be irritating.
All right. So you've been hinting at, some people watching this will know that you have done a podcast before, and now you're hinting at a season 2. But before we even get to that, do you want to give a brief overview of the first season? Like, what was the point of the first season and all that stuff?
Yeah. So season 1 of the podcast is called Amateur Exegesis. And season 1 was basically going over some contradictions, I guess you could call them, places in the gospel accounts where one author makes one claim and another author will make another claim. And those claims somehow are either mutually exclusive or can be read in such a way that they just can't be reconciled. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to explore those contradictions and then explain why they were there. So for example, we talked about, and I think it was episodes 2 and 3 of that, of the first season, the origin stories of Jesus. In Mark, he just kind of shows up out of nowhere, gets baptized by John the Baptist in the wilderness of Judea, and then, proceeds on his gospel mission into Galilee. Whereas in Matthew, of course, there's a birth narrative where it explains, where he came from. He was a descendant of David. He was born in Bethlehem. There was the wise men. Luke has a little different take on that. He has a birth narrative as well, but it's a different emphasis, and it has details that aren't found in Matthew. And they're new details. And of course, the Gospel of John just starts with the pre-incarnate Logos. He's the one who existed with God in the beginning, and that's way different than the synoptic authors. None of the synoptic authors would have thought of Jesus as pre-existent. They wouldn't have. To them, he was a human being through and through. But John's got a Jesus that is human, but has some elements of the divine. It's very Pauline. At least I think it is in some ways. But either way, that's the first season, just looking at the contradictions, why they exist in the first place. And I think that's very interesting.
Well, John's Jesus and the other Gospels are in perfect harmony, so I don't know what you're talking about. And there are no contradictions.
You've been reading Norm Geisler?
There's no contradictions in the Bible. I think you had mentioned the book Scripting Jesus.
Yes,
I bought that. I haven't worked my way through yet, but I've read a little bit of it. And it's definitely interesting, and it reminded me a lot of what you had been. It's not just saying here are these contradictions. It's like here's why they're there. Here's a plausible account of what's going on and why each author has their own unique perspective and all that. So that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, and if in different episodes in the podcast, I'll quote or refer to L. Michael White. Just because he has so many amazing insights in that book. I'm going to probably reread it next year. It was a very influential book in my life. So yeah, that's a great book. It's Scripting Jesus. Everyone needs to go buy it. It's just great.
Is there anything else that's sort of like that? Any other books you can think of that recommend to people that would fit the theme of your first season?
Good commentaries will often discuss the parallel passages. So if you read Joel Marcus's commentary on the Gospel of Mark, it's 2 volumes, he'll periodically touch on what the other authors are saying and why they make the changes, especially with the Gospel of Matthew. So his 2 volumes are part of the Yale Anchor Bible series, and they're phenomenal. And he does that at times. Robert Gulish, who passed away, it's got to be 30 years now or so. His commentary in the Word Biblical Commentary series, it just covers the first half of Mark, but it too discusses those kinds of topics here and there. And he was just a phenomenal. His was probably the first scholarly commentary on Mark that I ever had and read through, and it's just too bad he's gone. I just wish he was still around. He was an evangelical. I mean, he was a Christian, but he had just some great insights. But so those are two good authors' commentaries.
Right. Yeah, I think. Well, before you had been planning on turning season 1 possibly into like a book project. Is there anything you kind of?
Yeah, I'm still working on it. Some you've seen quite a bit of it. Mm-hmm. I'm still toying. I may end up not doing a book, but turning it into blog posts. Mm-hmm. And do it that way. I'm still toying around with it. It's a lot of work to. I want to kind of create a better foundation in terms of citations and make sure everything's documented. You know how I am.
Yeah.
So I got to have footnotes for everything. And that's kind of what I want to do with the first season is make sure all my ducks in a row. In fact, I'm working on this season's script still, the second season, but I'm making sure to get all my footnotes done now. So I'm not having to go back and do more later.
So that's why it's taking so long.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's been a beast.
Yeah. I saw you had a tweet where it was like, you had like, I don't know if it was 80, footnotes for one of the names. I think I'm podcasting wrong with the dog floating. And that made me laugh. Because I think you are podcasting wrong. Very
much so.
All right. So moving on to, and I would just say too, like I tweeted about this the other day too, just if someone's like a total novice to biblical studies, the New Oxford Annotated Bible and the HarperCollins Study Bible are just good resources to have. Yeah. So that if you're going to read through the Bible, if you're an atheist or a skeptic that wants to, read through the Bible on their own and then you have questions as you go, that's where you're going to go and look and find, kind of the scholarly consensus on certain passages. So I think those are good. I mean, there's more, but those are definitely two resources.
Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah.
So moving on to season 2, what can you tell us about season 2?
Yeah. So season 2 will be, it's pretty much an introduction to the Apostle Paul. His life and his thought, his theology, his letter writing, and using the epistle of 1 Thessalonians as kind of the springboard for that. So 1 Thessalonians was, in all likelihood, the first extant letter that Paul ever wrote. He might have written more before that, but we just don't have them. But we're generally, we're pretty certain, or scholars are pretty certain. I'm not a scholar, so I shouldn't say we, but scholars are pretty certain that 1 Thessalonians was the first of Paul's letters that we have. And so it's important because it gives us a glimpse into Paul before he became, the Paul of Christian imagination, the apostle of the Acts of the Apostles. He's this big figure later in Christianity, but in 1 Thessalonians, he's not quite the bigwig. He's a little different. He exhibits fear and trepidation. He's anxious. There's this emotional quality to him that we kind of miss by placing him in kind of a legendary status. So 1 Thessalonians is a great place to start with the Apostle Paul. Well, I think it is. And so the second season is going to be just a way to talk about him, what he thought about Jesus, about God, about the people he interacted with. And hopefully I can do that in 10 episodes. Hopefully.
Yeah, I was going to ask, one of the questions I had later was why you chose first, because we had talked privately, you said 1 Thessalonians as sort of a springboard. And I was thinking about, well, I mean, I guess it is like probably its first technically, I mean, like you said, you could have written before, but I imagine that the significance of it being like the first one, is the reason.
Very much so.
So why did you decide for this topic specifically in general anyway? Like zooming back a little bit further when you were thinking, well, what could I do for season 2? Like what was it that made you decide to go this route rather than a different one?
Yeah, so after season 1 ended back in 2019, I did a survey on Twitter, just kind of to see what people would like to, if they, both of my listeners, to see what they wanted me to do. And Paul became a dominant choice. Like people, really wanted to hear more about Paul. And that worked out well because my Hebrew is terrible, so I really didn't want to go into the Old Testament, into the Hebrew Bible. And I've never really done a deep dive into Paul before. So I thought, well, this would be a good chance for me to learn. That's really why I do anything, is to learn. That's why I write. That's why I do a podcast, is I want to know more about things. And then I want to share what I learn along the way. But so it was mostly people on Twitter saying Paul, Paul, Paul. And then me thinking, what about Paul? I knew quite a bit about the Gospel of Mark, but, Mark comes after Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Paul is our earliest author. And so he's our first glimpse into what Christianity, was back before, the fall of Jerusalem, before we had the narratives about Jesus. So, what does Paul think about this Jesus? Well, these are important questions that if you want to know more about the origins of Christianity, you need to ask and have answered. And Paul's the source. You got to go to him.
So how far are you actually with? Are you like close to being finished with you said it was 10 episodes?
Yeah. So I've got 4 scripts fully written.
Okay.
No, let me take that back. 3.5 fully written. But these early episodes are foundational, so they take more time to write.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm anticipating that the remaining episodes will be much easier to write. It's time consuming, but in the first couple episodes I talk about ancient letter writing, for example, the history of the area of Thessalonica, Paul in the book of Acts, and how it sometimes conflicts with what we read in the epistles of Paul. So these are kind of the foundational elements. And then throughout the season, I'll probably there's a passage in chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians that is seemingly very anti-Semitic. Like it can be read. It's bad. And so a lot of people think that it's an interpolation, that a later scribe inserted it as kind of this anti-Semitic polemic. But there's a growing voice of scholars that say this is not the case. This is not what happened. This is actually Paul. And so I'd like to deal with the subject of interpolation, but also how we determine what's Pauline. We have letters that probably weren't written by Paul that ended up in the canon. Well, how do scholars know that they're not really from Paul? That's a question I'd like to address too, and that'll be later in the season. Mm-hmm. But it's not quite as important as the first couple episodes.
Yeah, that's another. You're hitting all the questions I was going to ask later by just going, because that was another one that I was going to talk about, whether that was an interpolation or not, or what your opinion about that was. But I guess we can. Yeah. So what do you think it was, or what do you think?
No, I don't think it was.
You don't think? Okay.
No. I there's a couple reasons. Fundamentally, is we don't have any manuscripts anywhere that omit it. It's all there. Mm-hmm. The issue has to do with punctuation and placement. So Paul talks about, he's railing on the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets. Mm-hmm. There's a very famous article. I think it appeared in JBL 20, 30 years ago. And I forget the author's name. I just read it. You think I know it. But either way, the title of the article is The Anti-Semitic Comma of 1 Thessalonians 2, I think it's 14 and 15. So he calls the comma is anti-Semitic. If you take the comma out, the passage makes more sense. Because now you have Paul who's not talking about the Jews, the Jews, all of them killed Jesus, like they're all responsible. It's the Jews, specifically the ones that were behind the death of Jesus. Okay. So it narrows Paul's focus, which is fine. And it's polemic. Like he's just using this. He's angry. He's pissed off. He's been previous to this, he's been kicked out of Jerusalem. He's been, railed on by the Jews. He's undergone punishment in synagogues. So he's not too happy. And so he's really angry when he writes this. It's kind of like what happens in the Epistle of Galatians. He says all these terrible things about the Torah. But Paul didn't hate the Torah. He was a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
He was a good Jew. He didn't hate the Torah, but he hated the people that were trying to make his pagan converts into Jews. He didn't want that. So what does he do? What's his strategy? He's going to rail on the Torah. He's just going to, no, you don't do this, you don't do that. The Torah is not any good. It's not going to help you. It sounds very anti-Semitic. It sounds very anti-Torah. But if you understand what Paul's actually doing, it just makes more sense. So with that passage, I don't think it's an interpolation. I just don't think that we have to go there. I think you could make it work within Paul's argument.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. So, you've also mentioned that you're doing an incredible amount of reading in preparation for this. Yeah. So what have you been reading in preparation for a lot of this? Like, what are the different commentaries and books that you're reading?
Yeah, so there's 3 commentaries specifically I've been reading on First Thessalonians. There's Eugene Boring's commentary, which appeared in the New Testament commentary series. There is Earl Richards' commentary, which was part of Sacra Pagina, I think is how you say it. It's a Catholic series. And then there's Abraham Mallarby's volume in the Anchor Yale Bible series. All 3 are really good. Richards is not as useful to me because he thinks that First Thessalonians is not 1 letter, but at least 2. And that's kind of a minority position. Not many people take that view. So sometimes his comments, to understand them, you have to remember that he's arguing that there's two letters in 1. Mallarby's has been great, though, because he goes into some of the rhetoric of Paul and comparing it to philosophers of his day that he may or may not have read, but the rhetoric was around, and he uses that. He uses some of the strategies that these philosophers did in his letter. And then Boring's. If you have to buy one commentary on First Thessalonians, Eugene Boring is the place to go. He is the one. He's very clear. It's very easy to read, which is good for me because I'm an amateur. But he's just concise, excellent insights, and his introduction material is just fantastic. So those are the 3 commentaries. And then there's other books I've been reading. Morna Hooker's Paul, A Beginner's Guide, Paula Fredrickson's book on Paul that came out about 3 years ago. I'm trying to think. There's just so many. Oh, goodness. Paul, is it Paul Amidst the Philosophers? Paul and the Giants of Philosophy. That's another one that's been really interesting. It's a comparison of Paul and people like Seneca or Cicero, people like that from the ancient Roman and ancient Greek philosophical traditions, and that's been interesting to read too. But yeah, there's books on letter writing. I've read a couple books on that, just to kind of get a grasp of how ancient letters were written and what it took. And some of it was pretty boring, like really boring, really dry. Mm-hmm. But you learn stuff along the way that's, I think, is neat.
Yeah, it was. I reread First Thessalonians in preparation for this and some of the commentary notes, and I guess I didn't realize that there were scholars that thought it was a more than 1 letter kind of combined. So that was interesting that you said that, because I'm sure I had read notes like that in the past, but like as I was reading it and looking, I was like, I forgot about this. I don't know if I knew this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when it was kind of, I don't think I knew that before, or at least it didn't stick in my mind. Like I knew that about 2 Corinthians,
right?
I mean, that's almost definitely multiple letters. But First Thessalonians just looks like a unity. It looks like a unified document. You wouldn't expect anyone to think it's otherwise. But yeah, it's Richard had some interesting points. I mean, I just don't find them persuasive. But
so it's darn biblical scholars trying to corrupt God's word.
I know. Oh. those Catholics.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing too, you all had also made a comment in a tweet we were talking about, and I identified with it too because, well, recently I was reminded of it because I was reading another book, and because philosophy of religion can be dense, but there's a difference between people who are writing it at a very dense level, but they're still like their writing is not poor. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I was recently reading a book. I didn't read too much of it, so I'm not going to comment on it yet. But I was like, I was just the way that they were crafting their sentences. I was like, this is atrocious. Like what? It was painful. And I was excited for it too, because it looked like, I'd read some of the people that endorsed it, and I was like, okay, this might be good. But just, the stumbling block for me is if I'm not saying I'm a great writer, but I can recognize, atrocious writing, and it was bad.
Sometimes you read a book and you're like, did Yoda write this? What is garbage? Like, what is going on?
Yeah. The other thing too, kind of what you're saying, where a lot of boring reading, as I'm plowing through some of the more advanced philosophy of religion stuff, as I'm trying to catch up, is I'd read, some of Graham Oppy's stuff, like his The Best Argument Against God is a short book. It's really good. I'd read parts of Arguing About Gods, the bigger, like 500-page one, that is his contribution. And it's, those parts were interesting, but the first part is like discussing ontological arguments. And I'm like, oh my God. Like, I'm like, trying not to anyway.
You need some no-dos.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure that as I read more and more, I'll be more interested, but it's just, I don't know. The ontological argument is just not that interesting to me. I know as I learn more, it will be, but as of now, I'm more interested in other more popular arguments that are actually being used, because hardly anyone actually uses the ontological argument practically. And so,
I don't think I've ever encountered an apologist that the first argument they're going to roll out there is the ontological argument. It's usually it's the moral argument or the Kalam cosmological argument.
Right.
It's never Anselm, it's never nothing like that.
Right. So you'd also mentioned too before that you have a certain routine with all this reading you do. So can you want to explain your routine? You get up at a certain time and read all that stuff.
Yeah. So I was getting up at 5. I've been getting up a little bit earlier than that. But I don't just read for the podcast. There's other books I'm reading. So I'd like to get that reading out of the way. Like I'm finishing up Massimo Pigliucci's, again, I'm reading it again, his Field Guide to a Happy Life, and then I'm reading Marcus Aurelius. So I read, and I'm reading some poetry, but that's for pleasure. So I try to get that done. And then I also read, right now I'm finishing up the book of Daniel. So I'm reading through Daniel. I'm almost done with Mark and Greek. So that's been nice. But then I get to what I'm actually working on. And so I keep a little, like a list of the books I'm reading and the pages I need to read that day. And I go through it. I mark up. For some books, I took notes. Like I made an outline of the book. So I've got a few of those. But mostly it's spending time in the literature, setting a minimum goal. Especially if it's, so for example, if I'm going to be working on, let's say 1 Thessalonians 2, 13 through 16 next week. Let's just say, for example, I'm going to read this week some articles on the idea that it's an interpolation. And I'm going to read some sections in the commentary on that, on that particular set of verses, just so when I start writing my script, I have, an outline in my head of what have scholars said about this. So that's one of my strategies. And of course, if there's one thing that makes a huge difference in your writing, in your research, it's the literature that you interact with. And it's one of the reasons I can't stand apologetics, is it's just so, usually it's so vapid, just so, the citations are to other apologists, and it just absolutely irritates the fire out of me. It's not to scholarship. And when I look at somebody's footnotes and I see Lee Strobel, as opposed to somebody more prominent that deals with historical Jesus studies or something, I'm just like, really? Is this the best you can do? Like, that's it? That's all you got?
Yeah.
And so quality research, quality literature just makes a difference. It really does.
Yeah, like I've said before, I write little essays sometimes, but that's usually just like me, here's my opinion for 500 words about something. It's not intended. It's intended to, poke at people, but it's not always like, a lot of the apologetics is more like, here's this historical case for something, and I'm not gonna provide. Usually that's the difference, is like, I'll write like, a 500 word piece that is intended to poke at something. But if I'm actually trying to write something I know about, like biblical studies or something like that, then I'm, as with my last post, there's like the footnotes are like longer than the post itself.
That was real good. I enjoyed that. Oh yeah, that warmed the cockles of my heart. They, yeah, and so that makes the difference between people like you who kind of invest into reading the secondary literature and citing it, and other people like a certain pop apologist we know, who recently had a meme on Twitter where she said that there was all these hostile sources that affirmed Jesus' existence and his divinity. And one of them was the virgin birth, and it was Celsus, who was he's this second or third century, I can't remember, but I think he's third century because it's Origin who quotes him, but as proving the virgin birth was true. But she doesn't provide a citation. She just puts the name. But if you read Celsus, he's making fun of the virgin birth and saying that the Christians got it from all these other myths. He's not affirming it. I mean, but she put it up there like you would think that this was, he talks about it, so he knew it was true. No, cite your sources. Come on now.
It's ridiculous because I think it's just a culture among some, religious apologists where it's just you hear something and then you immediately parrot it like a shotgun blast of information.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like just a circular, like this whirlwind of just hearsay, and then you just continue to proliferate it on your own end, and it just spirals out of control or something like that. That just seems like what I mean, I can't imagine. I feel like if someone gave me some kind of fact that was like, that would be really great if that was true for my case. Let me make sure before I post that.
Exactly.
Sure. Like doesn't seem
like
a
little skeptical.
Yeah, it's not there. People are too trusting, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. The other thing you were talking about, you had different reading you were doing other than just the podcast. And, I'm sometimes in the morning, I usually read like 3 chapters of the Bible day and like 5 on Sundays to kind of go through it in the year. But like 2 chapters of narrative and like maybe like go to the Psalm or New Testament for the other one. Just depends. But I'm in like listening. Sometimes I'll listen. If it's more narrative, sometimes I'll listen to it. But I'm in like, because some of the jokes I've been making on Twitter, I'm in Leviticus right now. And so it's just all this fun stuff, we'll say. And it's funny because I'm listening to it on, I don't know if you've heard like the dramatized Bible stuff. It's like not just reading it. It's like, there's like sometimes like music that'll come in the background and someone's like, it's really cheesy, but at the same time, like sometimes it causes me to listen to it more.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've been doing that a little bit, but it's kind of funny. It's very corny.
Hey, however you get it.
So what do you think about this new season? What do you think that you're going to say that will trigger the fundamentalists the most?
Oh, wow. Where do I start?
I feel like
because it's just so easy to do. So one of the things, Christology, Pauline Christology. Paul did not think Jesus was God. Paul probably thought that he was some kind of divine being before he became human. I'm trying to be careful with how I say it. But for Paul, Jesus is God's agent, very much in the way that in Mark, Jesus is God's agent. And so you won't find, for example, Paul says, I thank my God for this. He says it a couple different times, but you'll never find him in any of his letters say, I thank Jesus for this. He never says it, which is strange. If you think he's God, why wouldn't you thank him? But Paul's very careful to make it pretty obvious that he thinks Jesus is not God. He may be divine in some sense, but he's clearly subservient to God. And you shouldn't expect anything else. Like I said before, he's a good Jew. He's a monotheist. He does not think there's any competition for God. And Jesus is not competition for God. Jesus is, he is not God. So that's one thing that probably will trigger fundamentalists big time. Another one is, I don't think the image of Paul in the epistles and the image of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles can be reconciled on the whole. Like there's aspects of it that jive, but there's places where they're telling 2 different stories. And for the inerrancy crowd, that sinks the boat. Now they'll disagree with what I have to say, and they'll have clever ways to rebut what I have to say. But I don't see it. Paul, the chronology doesn't work. Some of the things he says doesn't work. I mean, the way Luke writes makes it pretty clear that, yeah, he's writing history, but he's not writing history like you and I know it. So I think that those types of subjects are going to be really offensive to some. For people who read biblical scholarship, it's not going to be a surprise.
Right.
I'm not coming up with anything new. I'm just citing scholars. But for the people that really need the Bible to be perfect, it's going to be really, really upsetting. And I will probably get some hate mail.
By the way, the Bible's not there.
Yeah. There we go. BTW.
Yeah. You triggered some people with that one.
Yeah, I did. Oh, and I got frustrated. I had to mute it. I was like, I'm quitting Twitter. These people are dumb. Oh.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Are you hearing echo when I talk? I don't know if I'm the only one hearing it. Okay, good.
No.
Yeah, the other thing too is like, as I was reading, I recently I'd read some of it before, but philosopher Stephen Law had wrote a book called Believing Bullshit, How Not to Get Sucked into an Intellectual Black Hole. And one of the chapters was called It Fits. And he was basically saying like pretty much anything, if you try hard enough, can be reconciled into some kind of theory. So if he gave an example, it might not be exact, but it was like, someone thinks that like dogs are, alien spies. Like, and you say, well, how do you know that? Like, you say, well, there's transmitters in their brain. It's like, well, we cut open the dog and there's no transmitters in the brain. It's like, well, the transmitters are organic. They have advanced technology, so it just looks like it's part of the brain. And it's like, well, but what, so you can just keep going down the rabbit hole, and whatever your theory is, you can make an infinite amount of excuses to justify it. So as I've been thinking about the inerrancy stuff, and it just seems kind of analogous to that. I know that's offensive, but to me, that's.
It sounds like Carl Sagan's "Dragon in My Garage,"
right?
From his book, "The Demon Haunted World." There's a dragon in my garage. Oh, really? Is there? Then you go in. There's no dragon. Well, he's invisible. Oh, come on. Well, he breathed fire. Well, yeah, but he's the fire's heatless. You can't detect it with infrared, and you can't touch him. He's incorporeal, and there's all these ways. Yeah, it's ridiculous, but some people are so invested. They need it. They need it to be true.
Right. So one of the other things you had, maybe this is relating to something you've already said, but what do people often get wrong about Paul?
Well, what earlier I had mentioned his view on the law, and a lot of people, especially in the more traditional approaches to Paul, think of him as somebody who's, no Torah. We don't need to worry about the Torah. All those laws are gone, and Jesus has fulfilled the law. So Paul just kind of jettisons it, and that simply isn't the case. It's not what he does. I think we have to remember that Paul writes to pagans. He's not writing to Jews. He's writing to people who were worshiping idols. And the vein of Judaism that he belonged to, or at least from what we can tell, was one wherein he did not think that Gentiles had to convert. They did not have to become proselytes. And one of the reasons Paul thinks that is because, and this is to use language, I think it's Pamela Eisenbaum in her book, Paul Was Not a Christian. She says that Paul has looked at his eschatological clock, and he has seen what time it is. And it's almost the end. So there is no time for Gentiles to have to go through all these rituals to become Jews. There's just no time. Jesus is coming very soon. Also, Paul has read the prophets. He's read Isaiah. He's read Zechariah. And when they talk about the end, it talks about the Gentiles coming, but they come as Gentiles to worship God. They don't come as Jews. They're still Gentiles. So, when Paul writes, like in 1 Thessalonians 1, in verse 9, he says that the word about their faith has gone out, the Thessalonians' faith, to all these places, Macedonia, Achaia, everywhere else. And people have received a report that they have turned to God from idols. That's the fundamental issue for him. And that's the fundamental sin, the original sin of paganism was idolatry. Everything else stemmed from that. All of the other sins they committed was because they were idol worshipers. And so Paul thinks, okay, they need to repent of their idolatry and turn to Jesus and wait for him to come and have faith in God. And they don't need to bother with circumcision or, food laws, things like that, because frankly, the end's coming. This is not for them. It's for the Jews. It's for my people, my kinsman Israel. So, I think a lot of people just think Paul throws the Torah out, and he doesn't. He doesn't do that. And of course, the Christology thing has certain ramifications for certain kinds of fundamentalists. He just did not think that Jesus was part of the Trinity. He didn't believe in the Trinity, for one. It didn't exist, Those are probably the two biggest ones on misconceptions about Paul. Although another one might be that he was a murderer of Christians. This is the image that the book of Acts gives us. He's standing holding the coats, or actually that's Acts 26. In Acts 9, they lay it at his feet, the coats. But he's giving his approval to kill Stephen. In fact, the author makes that explicit in chapter 8, verse 1, and Saul approved of their killing him. But later in the book of Acts, Saul portrays himself not only as someone who approves of their killing, but is active in condemning them. Like, he wants them to die. And this is not a punishment that would have been meted out to Jewish Jesus followers. And it's certainly not something Paul would have been able to do. The punishment would have been in the synagogue, and it would have been 40 lashes minus one. That was the harshest punishment that a synagogue could give. It could not condemn you to death. No one was condemning anyone to death for believing in Jesus. So the image painted by Luke, and Luke is writing probably in the 2nd century, the image he paints is completely anachronistic. It did not happen. Moreover, Paul never claims that he killed Christians. He just calls himself a persecutor. And he says in Galatians he did it to the utmost, which a lot of scholars think probably means he gave them 39 lashes, 40 lashes minus one. So the image of Paul as this, rabid murderer of Christians is just, it's a fiction. It's an understandable fiction given the context in which the book of Acts was written, but it's still a fiction. At least if you go by Paul. I mean, Paul could be lying.
Yeah.
Well,
that's interesting, though. I wouldn't have. The next question was going to be about Paul's belief in the imminent end of the world, but I wouldn't have connected. I guess I hadn't thought deeply enough into the fact that the reason he was saying not encouraging the Gentiles to convert to Judaism is because there's not enough time. That's interesting. I don't think I've thought deeply into that because I knew enough to know that the expectations of the New Testament authors were that it was going to come too soon, but I didn't connect it necessarily to that. But yeah, so 1 Thessalonians, there's that passage where it talks about Jesus coming back, and it's like, we who are alive.
Mm-hmm.
All that language is very strong. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So that's chapter 4. Everyone knows that it's the classic Left Behind passage. Tim LaHaye made millions of dollars off that. But yeah, so Paul, he writes to the Thessalonians apparently in between the time that he's left Thessalonica and this letter that he's written to them, and we can talk about why he wrote the letter. But between those intervals, some of the faithful have died, and for whatever reason, this is causing inordinate grief among the Thessalonians. And there's some debate over exactly what that entailed. But Paul writes to them and says, "Well, we don't grieve as those who don't have hope, because we know, because we gave it to you by a word of the Lord, that." And then he gives a timetable that, we who, the dead in Christ, they're asleep. He compares death to sleep, which is a very common metaphor in both the Hebrew Bible and even in the synoptic gospels. She's not dead. She's just sleeping. They laugh at Jesus at one story for that. But so he uses the metaphor of sleep. And then he says, the dead in Christ will rise first. We will not come before them. We will not be at an advantage because we're alive. We'll all be there together with him. And like you said, he says we. Mm-hmm. Now in Greek, there's a way to say we. Like we have, when we use language, we have to say the pronoun and then the verb. Like we are going to the store. But in Greek, you don't need the pronoun. The verb has the pronoun built in. You understand who the subject is based on the form of the verb. But if you want to make an emphatic statement, one of the ways you do that is you throw the pronoun in front of the verb. So now the pronoun's there and the verb. So when Paul writes, he says, we who are alive. So he's emphasizing that he thinks he's going to be part of the end. Now, what's really interesting, though, is in Paul's later letters, this starts to change a little bit. He starts to seriously contemplate the idea that he might not be part of the final generation that is alive before Jesus comes. So he says, I think it's in maybe 1 Corinthians, but he says, whether we wake or sleep, we will be with him. He's thinking, well, maybe I'm going to die. Maybe this is going to be the end soon for me. But he still thinks Jesus is going to come back quickly. Like there's no question to him. If he dies, not long after, Jesus will return. But he has this hope that even the dead will be raised again and reunited with Christ in the air, and all the other believers. But yeah, he fully expects to be part of that final generation in 1 Thessalonians. Definitely.
Yeah, it seems like the expectations started to taper off, I guess you would say. Like I think it's 2 Peter, where it's like God is not slow with some count of slowness, like a day to him is like a thought, or I don't know exactly.
Yeah. In 2 Peter, the author is writing in the 2nd century. Mm-hmm. It's been a while.
Gotta say something like, God's time's not our time, to try to justify why.
Exactly, yeah.
Why the apparent, predictions didn't come true, Yeah. So what do you think that has to do with the fact that what do you think this has to do with whether Christianity is true or not? This idea that they had this expectation that was going to happen soon. I mean, obviously it undermines fundamentalism, but like
clearly, yeah.
How do you see that just when you think about the truth of Christianity? They had this, apocalyptic expectation of Jesus coming back soon, and it didn't happen. How do you see this relating to, like, at least for you, about how does it weigh and how you assess Christianity?
Yeah. So if I was going off the words of Paul was wrong.
Right.
So if I believed he was inspired by God, inerrant, whatever, because of God's Spirit, that's an immediate red flag. Paul was flat out wrong. And you can then ask, well, where is Paul getting some of these ideas? Like when he talks about a word of the Lord that he gave the Thessalonians, is he talking about a tradition that he received, from maybe Jesus himself? And we know already, we talk with Matthew Hart about this, about the Jesus saying,
Hartke.
What is it?
Hartke.
Hartke. Is that how you pronounce it?
I think so. Hartke. Oh, it's Hartke.
No, I thought it was just Harked.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Sorry, man.
I'm probably wrong. Trust me, I'm wrong about a lot of stuff. I put bacon in the Ziploc bag drawer the other day. Wow. Either way, but Jesus taught that the end of the world was coming soon. That generation would be the final generation, and was he wrong. So that has serious ramifications, because if Jesus is wrong, I mean, he certainly can't be divine.
It was his human nature just took over for a second. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. It's what is it? Mark 13, where he says, "No man knows the day or the hour, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son." Well, that's just the human nature of Jesus talking. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. But yeah, so if Paul's wrong about that, then what else is he wrong about? Is he wrong about sin? Is he wrong about his own experience of the risen Jesus that he claims to have had? So, these little things can open up these wide doors into wondering, what exactly Paul got right and what he got wrong, specifically about these very important subjects, especially for people at that time.
Right.
It was absolutely vital that Jesus come back soon, because things were not looking good. Like, it just was a rough time for everybody. So, but even more important now, I mean, we who are alive and remain. Well, now, wait a minute. Paul's been dead these 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
This is a problem.
Yeah.
Do you still expect him to, or is it going to be another one of those things where you spiritualize it, make it a metaphor, which is fine. You can do that.
I think, because there was other passages where it was talking like people were in, suffering incredibly, I guess. And one of the things to spur them on was basically like, well, Jesus is coming back, like hold fast, Jesus is going to, I don't know if it was in 2 Thessalonians, I can't remember, but it's something along the lines of, people are being comforted with the idea that like, just hold on a little bit longer. You know what I mean? Like,
our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed.
Right.
That's in Romans. He says that. But the book of Revelation is like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's written toward the end of the first century. And what does the Jesus say to the 7 churches over and again? I'm coming soon. I'm coming quickly, with my sword. And, they, when things got tough, they wrote narratives and told themselves stories to encourage them. And everybody does that. Everybody is. It's very human to do. You look at the Hebrew Bible, you see the same thing, that they're telling these. The book of Daniel is a great example. Daniel 12, the very first verse, Michael the prince will rise up, and then it goes into talking about the resurrection of the dead, and because things were looking bad, and they need encouragement. They have this hopeful expectation.
Yeah, I think when it comes to people that are willing to have, because for me and you, the fact that, we come to be convinced that Paul was wrong about something that serious kind of throws a wrench into the whole, machinery. But I think for people that I think it just depends on how much you personally weigh like the weight of religious experience, because to me, I guess I would have, even as a Christian, I would have put a lot of emphasis on it, I guess. But when there's red flags that my beliefs aren't in accordance with reality in different ways, I generally try to not default to my own personal experience. But some people do, and it's just a different way of, I guess, approaching religious belief. But anyway, so when it comes to Paul's letters, which ones do you think? What is your opinion on which ones he didn't write? Like, which ones do you think he clearly didn't write? I mean, I guess there's generally a consensus, I think, about certain ones, but I guess there's a bit of disagreement. What is your opinion about all that stuff?
Yeah, so the ones he most definitely wrote are 1 Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Philippians, and the epistle to Philemon. So it seems very clear that he wrote those. There's pretty much no debate among scholars. The consensus is he wrote those 7 letters. But there's significant debate over 2nd Thessalonians and Ephesians and Colossians, with a mixture of scholars saying, I think there's more scholars that think Colossians was legitimately written by Paul than Ephesians, because Ephesians seems to be dependent on Colossians. So whoever wrote Ephesians had Colossians available to them. In fact, the epistle to the Ephesians probably wasn't even the epistle to the Ephesians. It was probably a title, a adscription added later. So scholars are pretty sure the Ephesians probably wasn't. But the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Paul did not write those. We can be reasonably certain that he didn't. There's differences in vocabulary and style and themes, and the way he uses words is just a little different than he usually does. And that's one topic I'd like to cover probably in the episode. I talk about the interpolation in First Thessalonians 2, because it's interesting to see how scholars construct their arguments for, whether a document is legitimately from Paul or not. Like, how do they know that? Why do they think that? And of course, none of that is going to convince a conservative.
They're unbelievable.
yeah, exactly. So, but if you really want to, dig deep into it, there are some really good commentaries on those specific texts. Trying to think, who wrote, it was in the Hermania series. on the pastorals, but he goes into some of those, the reasons for why we think those epistles weren't written by Paul. And of course, Bart Ehrman does it too. He talks about those subjects. I think in his book, Forgery and Counterforgery, he may broach that. I have to look. I can't remember if he does or not. He does in his textbook on the New Testament, though. That's for sure. He does talk about it there. So that's a really good resource to have. But so I think the pastorals, without a doubt, not Paul.
Right.
They're later, end of the first century, probably. They kind of remind me of First Clement with some of the concerns, the way the government of the church is structured. And these are, you only need to structure your church government if Jesus hasn't come back for a while. You know what I mean? Like, why do you need to have qualifications for a bishop if Jesus has come back within a few years? Like, you don't need that. But when Jesus is kind of tarrying, you need to start thinking about, well, how are we going to keep this thing going? You know? And so that's the concern. That's the concern in those epistles.
So why did you try to turn? You've been doing like blog stuff. What made you decide to do like a podcast as well? Like, why did you decide to turn it into a podcast? What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, I kind of missed preaching. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not very comfortable speaking to people like publicly. I prefer to write, and that's because my mouth moves faster than my brain. You know, again, the bacon incident. Just before that, I had made some remark, and I thought I was very smart, and my wife put me in my place. Remember the bacon? Yeah. So I it's frustrating. I'm like my father in that way, but so I like to write because I can sit down and get my sources and put my footnotes, and I'm good to go. But when you're speaking, especially with extemporaneous speaking, there's some danger there. But I missed the idea of just having my voice out there. A podcast is a pretty popular medium. I thought maybe I could reach another crowd. A lot of people will spend time listening to a 15, 20, 30 minute, even, podcast that won't read a blog post that's 500 words or more. And I tend to write more. So it was just a way to get, out to another audience. I sometimes wax elephant. So writing is a
wax elephant.
Yeah. Doing a podcast is probably, it kind of forces me to curb what I want to say more than a blog post would,
To make it more succinct. Yeah.
Yeah. Even though this season, the episodes will be much longer. That's because I had some people who said they wished I had, delved into this more and spent more time on this. And there was kind of this feedback that said, we want more packed into an episode. So I may have misinterpreted that. This season may bomb, but I thought, well, let's give you some detail. Let's tell you a story about Paul. So
how did I haven't I've listened to your episodes on just through YouTube. So I haven't been paying attention to where else it is. How's it been doing on the other other venues other than your blog and YouTube? I think you put it I guess it would have been on Apple and stuff too.
Yeah. So WordPress hosts it. So I post it to my blog, and then that goes out to Spotify, Apple, there's a couple other, maybe SoundCloud. I can't remember, but I don't usually keep track of those numbers. I don't look at them, but WordPress does. So every once in a while I'll look down, and when the first season first happened, it was big numbers. Consistently, people were downloading the episode. But every month someone's listening to it. Someone is downloading 2-3 episodes, listening to them that I can tell. So there's definitely some interest in it, and I don't know who it is. Yeah. I've also noticed that someone has been using a citation, like a plagiarism software, to check some of my stuff. I don't know if they're trying to catch me in something like how WordPress has refers. Do you ever look at that?
Not really.
They have a list. It's refers, people that have clicked a link to get to your blog.
Oh yeah.
And a couple times this year, my refer has been this plagiarism website. And I'm thinking, did I plagiarize? I hope not. I try to be careful not to. But yeah, so there's been consistent downloads of the podcast. I think that's just so funny.
Yeah.
Oh, that just tickles me that somebody's doing that. I think I know who it is, but
Okay.
I think you know who I think it is.
Probably. So you're kind of weird, as an atheist online doing all this.
Oh, thanks.
Bible stuff. No, I'm weird. I feel like I'm weird. But, why do you think it's so important for atheists to be informed about like what when you engage with stuff? Why is it so important for people that want to engage religious people to actually know what they're talking about?
Yeah. So if I was going to talk about the theory of evolution by natural selection, I would make myself look pretty dumb most of the time. Like I've got the basic outline of it. I've read a few books here and there, but I don't have anything that approaches deep knowledge of the subject. So I don't usually talk about it. I just shut up. But I know a lot about the Bible. And for atheists that want to engage in, critiquing the Bible, it really helps to know it. And you think you tweeted out something recently about this?
Yeah.
About you might want to spend some time looking into it before you start critiquing it. And it's just
Bible made me an atheist. That's all.
Yeah.
No,
Gosh.
It was warm.
A long time ago, I made some comment about that in a blog post, and I got some pushback. But my only point was the same one that you made. Just because you reject the God of Christianity doesn't mean you've rejected God. You have to deal with theism, itself. But you need to know the subject matter. You need to know what you're talking about. It's like those dumb atheist memes, unicorns in the Bible. Just come on now.
I feel like my own goal, because there is, some like the atheist YouTubers are more sophisticated and some aren't, and as a kind of my own YouTube channel, I kind of want to be, and I guess this might sound bad, but I want to be the kind of YouTube personality that like maybe someone finds and like prays that I don't get more attention because I actually know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, exactly.
People are worried, like, I want to engage, the issues too, but at the same time, like, that's the reason is people, when Christians or religious people see the silly atheist content on YouTube and realize the person has no idea what they're talking about, there's no teeth to that. There's no, it's just kind of brushes right off. That's, and again, I don't think there's anything wrong with spicy rhetoric on occasion because I do it. And I don't think every single thing, like not everything I post is like rigorously academic, but behind some of the rhetoric, it's clear that I, generally speaking, know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, no, exactly. It's like I can engage with the arguments of a Ravi Zacharias, or I can, engage with a Richard Swinburne, or someone like that, or I can read Richard Dawkins, or I could read Graham Oppie. You got to pick the ones that are going to really represent the position well and know what they're talking about. Dawkins is great for evolution, but he's just terrible when it comes to the Bible. So don't read Dawkins to get your Bible critique. Read someone that knows what they're talking about. Don't read an apologist to get a great defense of Christianity, and the resurrection. Read somebody who engages in the philosophical literature. It's just frustrating to see that.
It's one of the reasons too, even when I, like, half the time, if I make a meme that's funny, like poking at something and it gets like, 30 to 50 likes or something, I'll like quote tweet it later. And it's like, here's a paper about biblical violence to read, like as a resource. Cause I feel, I can't just, part of me is like, there's a place for this, but also I want to like promote actual resources and as well as making fun of stuff. I can't just make fun of stuff constantly. I have to, back it up a little bit other than just laughing at it.
No, yeah. That's one of the reasons why any post I write will have a bunch of citations. Is if I can point you to good scholarship, I've done my job. If you start quoting me as an authority, I need to quit. I need to like shut the blog down because I'm a nobody. I'm a snow-covered turd. Compared to these actual biblical scholars. I just don't. I want people to read quality research from people who are in the know and point the way to good books and good articles. I think people like you and me, we are the appetizer.
Yep.
Before the main course. Our job is to kind of, signal what's coming. And I think if you and I do our job well, that's enough for me.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but it just feels enough for me.
Yeah, I've cited you before, but not as an authority. I was just more like, here's a,
No, yeah, well, but that's different. That's not like the Amateur Exegete says.
Yeah.
Who cares what I say? But if you
he's got a lot of citations in his post, go to his post about this so you can see the citations in his post.
Exactly. See, that's the point. Is who to go to, who to cite, who's going to give you a good foundation. And I hope that with my stuff that I kind of do that. I kind of say, here's this book, here's this scholar, here's what they think, and do with it what you will. I'm not original. I don't ever want to be original.
Well, just don't get too exasperated with the people online with the Dunning-Krugers. I know you tweeted that one thing, and it made me. I was like, no, don't quit. Don't quit. Just
every other day it feels that way.
Keep the faith, man.
So when oh God, I don't even know where to begin. Here's the Greek sentence. Here's my translation of it. This is why it contradicts this verse. Well, I don't know Greek, but come on, really. If you don't know Greek, don't comment on Greek. Just work with the English, and I'll try to work with you.
Or at least cite something that's like academic.
Yeah, but, there you go.
Right. Well, it's been a little over an hour. I really appreciate your time. So everyone, has hopefully wet their whistle for season 2 of Amateur Exegesis as it comes out, and I guess it's going to start coming out after early January. My hope is the first episode will drop January the 7th. Okay. And so let me just explain that real quick. So what's going to happen? This is the plan. It may change. The episode will drop on a Thursday. The following Tuesday, I will post a YouTube video version of it. And then I will also post onto the website the full script, citations and all, so that people can read it if they want to, and they'll have a resource to look through. And that's the plan. And it'll be 10 episodes long. So it'll run to either March, or I may push it out till May. I'm just still trying to figure out what I want to do exactly. But yeah, so hopefully January the 7th, the first episode will drop onto the website. It'll show up in everybody's feeds that subscribe. So, all right, well, sounds good. Hopefully I've built some anticipation. So I think thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. Hey, thank you, man. All right, take care.